Good morning and happy Memorial Day. Our Bible reading is going to be Hebrews 10, chapters 32 through 39. But call to remembrance the former days in which after ye were eliminated, ye endured a great flight or affliction, partly whilst ye were made a gazing stock, both by reproaches and afflictions, and partly whilst ye became companions of them that were so used. For ye had compassion of me in my bonds, and took joyfully the spoiling of your goods, knowing in yourselves that ye have in heaven a better and an enduring substance. Cast not away, therefore, your confidence, which have great recompense of reward. For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. For yea, a little while, and he that shall come will come, and will not tarry. Now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. But we are not of them who drew back unto perdition, but of them that believe to the saving of the soul. The Bible promises are checks drawn of heaven's bank that we endorse with faith and present of God and present to God for payment. True, but sometimes the checks are post-dated. It's upsetting to find that God doesn't operate according to our time schedule. Assuming God will respond immediately to our prayers, we rise from our knees expecting to find the answer waiting for us. But more often than that, there is a waiting period between the asking and the receiving. And this presents a problem to 20th century believers. In these days of instant coffee and instant credit, we have a low tolerance for delay. Tomorrow, says Eric Hoffer, has become a dirty word. The interim between asking and receiving is a precocious time for believers. Our faith droops, our feelings sell out to the enemy, and doubt unpacks its suitcase for an extended visit. C.S. Lewis said, "Faith is the art of holding on to things your reasons once accepted. In spite of your changing moods, when everything we once easily believed suddenly seems improbable and illogical, it is this hanging on faith that holds us on course and keeps us anchored to the unfailing promises of God." The 10th chapter of Hebrews deals with this hanging on faith and shows us how to wait for the promise. The Christians to whom the author wrote were facing persecution so severe their faith was threatened with collapse. Some were even taken of defecting. To shore up the walls of their collapsing faith and to enable them to emerge from this trial, the author reminds them of their previous trials and how they overcame them. He speaks of a great reward in verse 35 and of receiving what was promised in verse 36. The entire passage dovetails into the last phrase in verse 36. This is the end toward which everything moves, that you may receive what was promised. He is telling them what they must do if they are to receive what was promised. There must be confidence based on God's past fulfillment. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Verse 35. Confidence, sometimes translated boldness, is one of the great words of the Bible and is a chief characteristic of believers. It means conspicuous courage in the face of adversary. Confidence is job declaring, though he slay me, yet I will serve him. It is Paul and Silas singing praises in prison. It is the apostles standing on board a sinking ship and saying, I believe God. These Hebrew Christians are exhorted to remember the former days, in verse 32. Days of persecution following their conversion to Christ. Through they were stripped of their possessions, they found God's grace sufficient. Their greatest possession, their wealth in Christ, could never be plundered. Possessing nothing, they possessed everything. Loss of all worthy goods failed to diminish their assets. Bankrupt but rich, they were wealthy paupers. And now it was happening again. Remember, cries the author. Remember the former days. The past, with its record of God's fulfillment, is our greatest defense against present discouragement. We preserve our confidence by remembering. The exhortation to remember is one of the most frequent in the Bible. It is the watchword of faith. How easily we forget the goodness of God. I recall more than one instance when, having been delivered by God's grace at the 11th hour, I vowed I'll never doubt God again, but a few weeks later, when another seemingly insolute situation loomed on the horizon, I found myself cowering in the corner of self-pity, whimpering and whining. Forgetfulness is definitely hazardous to your health. Let me encourage you to start a book of remembrances. Most bookstores have hardcover books filled with blank pages. Use it to record all the instances of God's help and deliverance and answers to prayers. Prayer is cheaper than brains. A chronicle of healings and deliverances may someday mean the victory and defeat. There must be obedience to God's present will. For your need of endurance, so that you will have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. In verse 36. Faith is not idle. It works while it waits. We can expect God to fulfill His promise only if we fulfill His will. The psalmist links faith and obedience when he says, trust in the Lord and do good. Psalm 37:4. Doing good is proof we are trusting the Lord. If the circumstance through which we are passing disturbs us to a point we can't carry on in our daily obedience and duty, then we have not really trusted the matter to Him. Satan's strategy is to distract us from the will of God by paralyzing us with fear and anxiety. While we are waiting for God in His own time to fulfill His promise, we must keep our obedience up to date. Spurgeon, discussing why God delays the answer to certain prayers, suggests the possibility that we have not yet performed a duty which will become the turning point of our condition. The Lord turned again in the captivity of Job when he prayed to his friends. Some ordinance of the Lord's house may lie neglected, or some holy work may be left undone, and this may hinder the promise. It is so. Is your obedience up to date? There must be patience for God's future work. For you need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what was promised. In verse 36. The third condition for receiving the promise is patience. Often translated patience. This is the bridge between doing the will of God and receiving the promise. Receiving what God has promised depends upon not only doing the will of God, but enduring. After His will has been done, many fail to receive because they fail to endure. The writer is using the language of the athlete. A football team may lead their opponents by 100 points, but if they grow weary and quit after the third quarter, they will forfeit the game. We may be filled with confidence. We may obey all God's commands, but if we lack patience, it is all for nothing. The patience which Philo calls the queen of virtues is more than simply waiting or passive resignation. Barclay says that there is no single English word that transmits all the fulfillment of its meaning. The Greek word literally means an abiding under, and contains the ideas of steadfastness, consistency, staying power, rather than being passive. Biblical patience is a lively, outgoing power of faith and active energy. The word is most often used in connection with trials. In classical Greek, it was used of the ability of a plant to live under hard and favorable circumstances. If, as the writer says, we need endurance, then we can expect to encounter difficulty. Depend on it, Faith never escapes testing. It is only by the testing of our faith that Christian character is produced. And isn't that the real goal of everything in our Christian experience? Isn't the important thing not what we get, the blessing, but that our character is perfected? James tells us to count it all joy when we fall into various trials, James 1:2. But we can do this only if character means more to us than comfort. The patience contains the quality of expectation. It is not waiting, hoping God will answer. It is waiting, knowing God will answer. With God's timing is more important than time. He knows what He is about, and we must wait with patience, expectant, excited endurance for God to fulfill His promise in His time. Whatever the reason for the delay, rest assured that God's timing is perfect and that His delays are as much of a part of His redemptive purposes as are His fulfillments. And if we learn the art of waiting for the promise, we may discover the delay to be a great blessing than the fulfillment. With God, it is often better late than never. And on that note, I want to have a short prayer for Memorial Day, so just a silent prayer, and then we'll go to the benediction. And now with our Memorial Day benediction, Pastor Jessica.
May we trust in God's promises to His people. Peace, security, blessing even when it is difficult to see. May you know that God's news is good news, nurturing, true, even when people tell you it's not. And when you encounter doubt, may you be strengthened. Your belief will guide you in His perfect wisdom and counsel. Amen.